The Lifestyle Show, presented by Selina MacKenzie.
Now, what role could music play in a death camp? What was the effect on those women who owed their survival to their participation in Nazi propaganda project? And how did it feel to be forced to provide solace to the perpetrators of a genocide that claimed the lives of their families and friends? Well, our final guest today hopefully can help us answer that. Welcome to the show, historian Sebba.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. From one croaky voice to another. I hope you manage okay. So we're obviously talking about the war. We're going back to 1943 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. I mean, there were apparently 50 women that were forced to be in this orchestra. Were they from all walks of life, different ages, playing different instruments?
Completely varied, you're right. That's one of the extraordinary aspects. The youngest was about 15. Some of them had just had 2 years playing recorder in school, were barely musicians at all. And there were one or two who were serious, would-be professionals. In fact, the oldest was 56, but she didn't survive. So great variety. The Nazis insisted on it being half Christian, half Jewish, and amongst the Jews there were Zionists, atheists, religious Jews, just a mishmash or a mélange, or as some of them called it, a raggle-taggle girls' band, because it really was not in any way a professional orchestra, and yet they played for their lives and did what the Nazis wanted. They became a marching band.
And although they were all different religions, as you say, and from different walks of life, did they all pretty much get on because they had to? They sort of formed a bond?
Well, yes and no. When they had to, they played their hearts out, because their main conductor, Alma Rosé, who was the niece of Gustav Mahler, coached them all day long until they were good enough. And she was a firm disciplinarian. If they played something wrong or badly, she would make them scrub the block floor for a week. And she said to them, if you don't play well, we'll all go to the gas. We stand or fall together. And I think that's why I found it such an extremely moving story, because they did cement together when they needed to, but at other times, believe it or not, there was even anti-Semitism, because the Polish Christian women were allowed to receive food. The Jews not only weren't allowed to, there was nobody at home who could send them food. And they were all in one block. That was the main privilege that Alma Rosé won for her girls, that they had a dedicated music block where they slept and ate and practiced. And so they had to pull together when it was necessary, because they recognized that there was no point in just one of them being good. They all had to be good, or the Nazis would say, we don't need an orchestra. And their main purpose was to play as the other prisoners went out to work and as they came back, because by playing, the prisoners had to march in time, and it made it easier for the Nazis to count in rows of 5. So that was their purpose. And as long as they fulfilled that purpose, they would stay alive. So they really had to play well, and they had to overcome any differences. But there were tremendous differences, and they mostly revolved around food, not surprisingly enough.
Well, no, when you're absolutely starving, it's understandable. So they were playing for the other inmates to make them march. I understand that. Did they ever have to play for the Nazi officers as well?
Yeah, well, you don't say no when a Nazi comes into the shed and says, I'm so exhausted, we've had such a terrible day gassing people. Now I want some soothing music. And for example, he would ask the cellist, who's still alive, an amazing woman called Anita Lasker-Wallfisch. She's 99.
Wow.
And she remembers very clearly being asked to play Schumann's Träumerei, an absolutely beautiful, soothing piece of music. She said, I just played it as quickly as I couldn't look him in the eyes, and hoped he'd get out as quickly as possible. And that was Mengele. So, they did occasionally and you don't say no. And because Alma Rosé was really musical royalty, I mean, she was one of the leading violinists pre-war, and she had her own troupe of other women who she toured around the world with. So she was sometimes asked to do 3-hour Sunday concerts. And although she handpicked a few of the best orchestra members, it was mostly carried by her. So the pressure was enormous. I mean, they weren't let off lightly, even though people think, an orchestra, it's not as bad as having to be part of the demolition squad. No, maybe it's not. But it wasn't much fun either. And you certainly never refused, because then you were sent to the punishment commando, the strafe commando, and you'd be starved until you died, or thrown in a gas chamber.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. So did you manage to interview any of them? I mean, you mentioned Anita, who's still around at age 99. Did you interview Anita then?
I've interviewed Anita several times, and she is an extraordinary personality. And I can't tell you what a difference it makes to meet someone who has really been through it all. But I also suddenly discovered there was another woman still alive, Hilda Grunbaum, as she was, another German who was died when she was 100 last year. And I managed to fly to Israel and meet her when she was 99. So I've met 2 of the women in the orchestra. I've interviewed others who weren't in the orchestra but had to sit and listen to them. And I will never forget one of the women telling me, we were just told to sit outside. It was a warm summer's day, and we were told to sit on the ground. And we were sitting on a pile of hot ashes. Oh. Can you just imagine what it's like? The ashes spewing out of the chimneys of people they might have known, killed a few hours ago. The ashes spread all over the camp. There's even a project called Violins of Hope, and I interviewed the man who created that, Amnon Weinstein, and he specializes in Holocaust instruments. He takes them apart and he finds black soot inside them from the crematoria. So to talk to people who have really witnessed it is just, for me and for what I'm doing, absolutely essential. It's not simply a question of Holocaust deniers. It's a question of trying to enter imaginatively into the minds of these people. And every survivor of a camp will say to you, you can't know what it was like unless you were there. Of course you can't know. So what I've tried to do is just put into the words of these women themselves what it was like, to let them speak for themselves. And there are many testimonies online. I say my prayers to Steven Spielberg every night, because after Schindler's List, he created this extraordinary archive or bank of Shoah testimonies. And with the right finding aid, you can hear people speak who remember hearing the orchestra. So there's no shortage of material.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you got to speak to Hilda before she died, and to Anita, but there are some survivors still, thank goodness, not many, but they don't like to talk about it, do they? And I understand that as well.
Of course, there will be people who never talked about it until probably their grandchildren. They wanted to bring their children up in peace and quiet and normalcy. They wanted to put these terrible memories out of their minds. And then when their grandchildren started questioning them, actually, what I find, and I do a lot of interviewing of old people, I just absolutely love it. And you find that their memories of a time, a dramatic time like this, when they were possibly teenagers, is very clear in their minds. And most people, I think it's a basic human urge, along with the basic human urge to survive, which is what my book is about. But the other basic human urge is to make sense of your life. So I think a lot of old people, before they die, want to feel, actually, my life was not completely in vain. I want to tell this story. Now we're coming up to the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Belsen and the end of the war. And so there won't be many survivors for another big anniversary. And that was why I wanted my book to be published now, to celebrate this extraordinary spirit of survival and to help create a three-dimensional image of the women in the orchestra, because what the Nazis tried to do is obliterate the Jews, obliterate Jewish culture, obliterate the people who were in the camp and reduce them just to a number. And I'm trying to put flesh back on their bones, even though they survived. As you rightly said, many of them did not talk about it. I want to celebrate the fact that they not only survived, but by surviving, to me, that's the number one act of resistance. Here were the Nazis trying to exterminate them, and these women survived. So I just can't talk about it often enough. It feels to me so vital that we do remember these people who suffered and make sure their suffering was not in vain, totally in vain.
Yeah, hear, hear. So from your research in the book, do we get to meet all 50 women individually?
Well, I haven't written an encyclopedia. There is, of course, a cast list at the back, and I try to name them all, but I want to make the book readable. So I focus on a few of the main characters. The main characters in the orchestra were, of course, Anita and Hilda, not just because they survived. They obviously were leaders and fine, fine people. But Alma Rosé, the main conductor, was an extraordinary person. And she's the only one who died. She saved all these others from the gas chambers, and she died food poisoning, probably botulism. Nobody really knows if it was deliberate or not. But there are also a few Nazi characters. Maria Mandel, the female guard who was responsible for setting up the orchestra. I mean, she was hanged in January 1948, and cry no tears for her. She was a brutal sadist, but she did set up this orchestra, and I think one needs to understand how complex these motives were. Perhaps she only became a Nazi because she was rejected by a boyfriend. Perhaps she only set up the orchestra because she wanted to impress another Nazi boyfriend that she was cultured. Nobody quite knows, but I think we owe it to the survivors to try and understand how could this happen and who were these people. Even people who were cultured and pretended to love music could be brutal and sadistic. People are complex. Human beings are complex.
You don't put it together, do you? Think of beautiful music like a violin or a cellist, and you think how beautiful it is, and then you can't put it together with somebody who's evil and would do the things that I guess she did, Maria Mandel, for example.
Well, I think I've had to expand my mind to try and take it all in. And I think that's what Anita said to me very early on when she was forced to play Troy Marai, and she has told that story several times, and she said, sometimes I regret telling it, but I wanted the world to know that even people who love music, who were educated and cultured, could also be beasts responsible for the greatest cruelty imaginable. And I think one does have to expand one's mind and try and understand how these people were capable of such crimes against humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell how passionate you are about the subject, and I'm with you all the way there. It's one of my subjects that I like to research as well. It's been described as impressive, important, and deeply moving. The book is called The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, A Story of Survival, and it's by Anne Sebba, who we're chatting to now. Anne, do you have a website if people want to find out more about you?
Absolutely, yes. It's an obvious address. It's www.annesebba.com. And I love hearing from people who read my books and what connections they make, because many people of my generation, I'm a baby boomer, had parents who fought in the war. In fact, it was my own father's war. He was a tank commander who went into Belsen, and discovering his notes, I realized he was at Belsen when the remnants of the orchestra had been evacuated to Belsen. So he must have crossed paths with them. And as soon as I discovered that, I was just mesmerized by this story, or perhaps magnetized is a better word. I couldn't leave it alone. So, yes, please do wander around my website and tell me what you make of this book.
Well, I'll certainly be doing that. Thank you so much, Anne, for joining us today. I hope your throat gets better.
Well, I hope yours does too. Must be something in the air, but I've enjoyed talking to you, and I forgot about my throat while I was talking. So.
Me too. Thank you very much. Have a good day, Anne. Bye-bye.
And goodbye now.